Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Module 77 and Module 78, Prejudice and Discrimination and Aggression. So let's go ahead and let's hop into topics that I know are going to be a little difficult, but are definitely well worth it for us to discuss. So what is prejudice? Prejudice literally means prejudgment. It is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude towards a group. Often this group is of a different cultural, ethnic identity, or gender from one's own group. Prejudice is a three-part mixture, much like one's attitude. It's made up of beliefs. In the case of prejudice, these are known as stereotypes, which are a generalized belief about a group of people. Emotions, in the example, hostilities or fears, and predispositions to action, primarily in the form of discrimination. Now, ethnocentrism, assuming the superiority of one's own ethnic group, is one example of a type of prejudice. To believe that a person of another ethnicity is somehow inferior or threatening, or to feel dislike for that person and to be hesitant about hiring or dating that person is to be prejudiced. Prejudice itself, it's important to understand, is just an attitude. Discrimination, the behaviors resulting from prejudice, are the negative behavior towards a group and its members. Now, how prejudiced are people? To assess prejudice scientifically, we can observe what people say and what people do. For example, Americans' expressed gender and racial attitudes have changed dramatically over the last half-century. The one-third of Americans who, in 1937, told Gallup pollsters that they would vote for a qualified woman, whom was their party nominated for president, soared to 89% in 2007. Support for all forms of racial contact, including interracial dating, has also dramatically increased in this point in time. Now, as overt prejudice is starting to wane, subtle prejudice is lingering in society. Many people who say they feel upset with someone making racial slurs actually, when hearing such racism, respond indifferently, for example. Overt prejudice is still present in many places, though. In a survey by Sod, and also by Weick and Grimm, it was found that after 9/11, about 4 in 10 Americans acknowledged some feeling of prejudice towards Muslim people. And about half of nonviolent Muslims in Western Europe and the United States perceived Muslim people as violent, even though this was not the case. This is just prejudice. Now, it's not only racial prejudice that continues to exist, but a gender prejudice too. Despite no gender differences in intelligence scores, people tend to perceive fathers as more intelligent than mothers. And there's also a sex ratio bias that's present amongst Chinese, Korean, and Asian Indian parents whenever it comes to a third child. Sons outnumbered daughters by 50% after 2 previous girl births. This isn't present given a previous boy birth or given Caucasian parents. However, in general, people feel more positively about women than they do about men. Worldwide, people see women as having some traits such as nurturance, sensitivity, less aggression that most people prefer. This may explain why women tend to like women more than men like men on things like friendship. This even applies to faces. It was found that people actually tend to prefer slightly feminized faces, computer-generated faces, men and women's, to slightly masculinized faces. Researchers David Parrott and his colleagues in 1998 speculated that a slightly feminized Male face connotes kindness, cooperativeness, and other traits of a good father. Let's go ahead. And let's talk about the social roots of prejudice now. Now, while some people have money, power, prestige, and others do not, those that have usually try to justify things as they are through attitudes. This is known as the just world phenomenon, the attitude and belief that good is rewarded and evil is punished. From this, it's but a short leap to assume that those who succeed must be good, and those who don't succeed must be bad. It's important to have those quotation marks. Such reasoning enables the rich to see both their own wealth and the poor's misfortune as justly deserved in their eyes. With this type of thinking, stereotypes can rationalize inequalities, and please take the quotation marks on that very seriously. Victims of discrimination may react with either self-blame or anger, and either reaction can feed further prejudice through blaming the victim dynamic. Does poverty create a higher crime rate? If so, that higher crime rate can be used to justify discrimination against those in poverty, believing them to be violent. Now, another part of prejudice can come from in-groups and out-groups. We tend to naturally divide the world into us versus them, those in our groups and those outside of our groups. Dividing the world into us versus them entails racism and war, but it also provides the benefit of communal solidarity. We cheer for our groups and are willing to take extreme actions to protect said groups that we're a part of. It also provides a level of solidarity between people. We gain almost a social identity through the groups that we affiliate ourselves with. Through our social identities, we associate ourselves with certain groups and contrast ourselves with others. Now, it's important to understand what an in-group and an out-group is. An in-group is us, those people for whom we share a common identity. This can be a generational group, a group based on interests, a group based on gender identity, a group based on racial identity. There's plenty of different examples of in-groups. Whatever can form a shared identity can become an in-group. Now, the out-group is them, or the people that are perceived as different or apart from the in-group that we are a part of. It almost mentally defines a circle around us, the in-group. It states who you are and who you are not. Now, once we have defined in-groups and out-groups, there can be a level of bias which comes out of these divisions. In-group bias primarily, in which we favor those that are a part of our own group. And what we've noticed is that this in-group bias, even if it is a group that is randomly assigned, people do tend to be biased towards that group that they are a part of, even if it is a randomly assigned group. You can have a group of 10 people, flip a coin for each, and the people who got heads and the people who got tails will still have more positive regard for their own group than the other group, even though it was a 50-50 chance that they would have ended up in either group. Now, the emotional and cognitive roots for prejudice are a little interesting. The scapegoat theory is one part of the emotional roots for prejudice. When something goes wrong, finding someone to blame can provide a target to release anger and negative emotions. This primarily works to increase our own sense of self and self-status. In order to do that, it can help to have somebody to disparage or to put down. However, this doesn't just work by putting someone down to raise somebody up. This does work in reverse. Those who feel love and supportive are more likely to be tolerant of differences in other people. The cognitive roots for prejudice, however, tend to come from the way that we simplify the world. There is so much stimuli going on, so much information coming into our heads, that in order for us to understand the world, we tend to categorize, to simplify things. We categorize animals, we categorize plants, we categorize cars, but we also categorize people, whether that be by race, by gender, or by another criteria. We categorize people too. But by categorizing people, we often base this on stereotypes. This can really be seen in categorizing people by race, with mixed race people often being assigned their minority identity. For example, despite a mixed race background and being raised by a white mother and white grandparents, Barack Obama has been perceived by white Americans as African American. Researchers believe that this happens because after learning the features of a familiar racial group, the observer's selective attention is drawn to that distinct features of that less familiar minority. We also have this tendency to overestimate the similarities of outgroups and overestimate the differences of in-groups. We recognize very quickly how much we differ from individuals in our own groups, but we overestimate how homogeneous, how similar other groups are whenever both groups have the same level of diversity and similarity to each other. This overestimation of difference is what's known as the other race effect, and shows up with this other race effect. We have a greater recognition for faces of our own race, and this actually emerges during infancy, between 3 and 9 months of age. Now, with effort and experience, people get better at recognizing individual faces from other groups. People of European descent, for example, more accurately identify individual African faces if they've watched a great deal of basketball on television. That exposes them to more African heritage faces. So, with experience and with practice, we can work to overcome prejudice. Remember that prejudice and even discrimination are simply beliefs and actions. We can work, if we desire so, we can work to change those beliefs. We can work to change and not take those actions that lead to discrimination. Let's go ahead and let's talk about aggression. Now, while prejudice hurts, aggression can hurt more, and often does. In psychology, aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy, whether out of hostility or as a calculated means to an end. Now, aggression often arises out of an interaction between biology and experience. And it's important for us to realize that aggressive behavior is not the same as assertive behavior. A lot of people do not make that distinction. A lot of people make that confusion. A pushy, assertive salesperson is not aggressive. Now, a person spreading rumors, verbally assaulting or mugging someone, that is aggression. That is a show of aggression. Aggressive behavior, what we have noticed, is that it tends to emerge from an interaction between biology and experience. Now, whenever it comes to biological factors of aggression varies too widely from culture to culture, era to era, and person to person to be considered an unlearned instinct. On some level, the way that we introduce aggression is learned. However, biology does influence our tendency to be aggressive. There's 3 different levels of biological influence, genetic, neural, and biochemical, and we'll be talking about each of these. Genes do have an influence on aggression. We've seen this in animals. Animals can be bred for aggression or aggressiveness, sometimes for sport, sometimes for research. But the effect of genes also tends to appear in twin studies. What we've generally seen, according to Miles and Carey's reports in 1997 and Rowe et al. In 1999, was that if one twin admits to having a violent temper or reports aggression, the other identical twin, is more likely to admit the same. And this result was not seen with fraternal twins. Fraternal twins were much less likely to respond similarly to one another with regards to aggression. Now, even if we don't have an area in the brain related to aggression, we do have excuse me, I'm sorry, I took a drink wrong. We do have some level of neurological influence that works to either inhibit aggression or to facilitate an aggressive response. And we've seen this through a few different research studies, such as a study in which researchers implanted a radio-controlled electrode in the brain of a leader of a caged monkey colony. One small monkey learned to push the button every time the boss became threatening, which inhibited the aggression that leader monkey was showing. Another example was a neurosurgeon who sought to diagnose a disorder implanted an electrode into the amygdala of a mild-mannered woman. At the flick of a switch, she would change from this mild-mannered persona to a level of aggression, increasing in agitation verbally, and actually beginning to strike the doctor. Now, biochemicals within us can also affect our aggression. One primary chemical that people look at is testosterone. Humans are far less sensitive to hormonal changes than we believe, but as men age, their testosterone levels and their aggressiveness diminishes. People who are aggressive at 17 will be much less so around the age of 70. High levels of testosterone do correlate with an irritability, an assertiveness, impulsiveness, and a low tolerance for frustration, qualities that can predispose someone to more aggressive responses. So, on some level, there is a level of testosterone high levels of testosterone can predispose people to aggression. But let's go ahead. Let's talk about the psychological and the sociocultural factors of aggression. While suffering can sometimes build character, the adage that misery loves company is also correct. Those that are made miserable have often made others miserable to be in the same type of group. And this was shown in a study by Berkowitz in 1983 and 1989. Berkowitz found that a phenomenon was shown called the frustration-aggression principle. Frustration creates anger, which can spark aggression. While competition can create frustration, other aversive stimuli can affect anger or frustration. This includes things like physical pain, hot temperatures, personal insults, foul odors, cigarette smokes, crowding, and other such stimuli. In laboratory experiments, when people get overheated, they think, feel, and act more aggressively. So it's important for us to keep in mind the external factors that may be leading to aggressive behavior. But it's not just these types of things that influence aggression. Reinforcement and modeling can also help us to either increase aggression or to mitigate it. Okay, and we'll talk about this last for the evening. Aggression may be a natural response to aversive events, but learning can also alter our response and our reactions. In situations where we have learned that aggression creates an effective response, that being aggressive pays, we're likely to act aggressively again. Now, to avoid this, to foster a kinder, gentler world, we need to model and reward sensitivity and cooperation from an early age, perhaps by training parents to discipline without modeling a level of violence, things like that. Now, modeling to avoid aggression can take place for people who have previously shown aggression in the form of aggression replacement programs. These types of programs work with juvenile offenders and gang members and their parents. It teaches both generations new ways to control their anger and more thoughtful approaches to moral reasoning. The result of these types of programs, youth rearrest rates actually drop whenever these programs are put into place. Now, it's important to know that one's culture can also influence the tendency towards violence. Cultures that have a greater disparity between rich and poor do tend to have higher crime rates. And violence can also vary by culture within a country itself. Two researchers named Richard Nesbitt and Dov Cohen analyzed in 1996 among white Americans in southern towns settled by Irish herders, who traditions emphasized honor, the use of arms to protect one's flock and such types of beliefs. These towns often experienced more violence than those settled by more traditionally peaceful groups such as Puritan, Quaker, and Dutch farm artisans. So it's important to understand how culture can potentially influence our reaction, what we may have learned via that culture. But with that is what I have for you this week. Please answer the questions that are posted onto ThinkWave, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your week and stay safe, everyone.